What Bitcoiners have been warning about for years is now happening right before our eyes. The US dollar system is collapsing, and the Federal Reserve, the US central bank, is saying the magic words. They are now ready to inject liquidity into the market. Everyone has been waiting for this. For the first time, US Treasury yields are now shooting above 5%. This is absolutely huge and means that trust in the USA is being completely lost. There are official responses to the downgrade of the USA's credit rating. The official economic advisor of the USA says that it's not a problem at all, but that's obviously a blatant lie, because we can see that it's a huge problem, and even the Federal Reserve is now ready to pump money into the market. For Bitcoin, this is the ultimate endgame scenario. This is exactly the scenario that many Bitcoiners have been preparing for years. I said it over and over again. Watch the bond yields, especially the long-term ones. If we break out to the upside here, then we're facing a critical point. And it seems that this critical point has now been reached. Right now, there's a lot of uncertainty, especially since new uncertainty is coming in from China, because all of a sudden they want to change the trade deal with the US again and are sending threats over to the US. Bitcoin is actually holding up pretty well, all things considered. Now we need to take a look at all the chaos in the market, why this is putting so much pressure on the US dollar, on the USA, on Donald Trump, but on the other hand, how it's playing perfectly into Bitcoin's hands. Everything is going according to the game plan, just as it was predicted for years. And that's exactly how it's happening now. And if we're about to really get started, then go ahead and hit the like button down below. That's also a sign of solidarity with your fellow people. So these videos get shown to everyone, so people don't misunderstand what's going on here and can draw the right conclusions. Also, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, so these videos keep getting shared and everyone stays up to date with what's going on right now. Because if you're not well prepared, you're definitely going to get caught off guard here. We also still have purchases for MetaPlanet, micro sale, and so on. There's a ton of stuff happening again today, but let's start right from the beginning. First, we had the situation with China, which has now issued a statement regarding the adjustment of chip export controls by the US, claiming that the US has seriously undermined the consensus reached during the Geneva talks. Just a few days after the conclusion of the trade agreement between the US and China, China is calling on the US to correct its misconduct. And of course, this is a shock for the markets at first. If you were thinking, okay, things are really good now, they somehow managed to put together a trade deal, and now everything is all cleared up for the time being. But as you can see, this time the chaos isn't coming from Trump's side again, because usually it would always be from Trump's side. Now it's China that's bringing chaos into the whole situation. And of course, the markets don't really like things like this. As I said, Bitcoin is holding up pretty well here. Of course, we crashed overnight, but now it's already starting to recover somewhat. And it would also be really interesting to see how this all plays out together with the bond yields. But we'll get into that in a moment. And also Bitcoin, because if something breaks in the bond market here, if bond yields keep shooting up and the Fed has to step in, then we have the absolute escalation scenario for Bitcoin here, the one we've been waiting for such a long time. A quick note on China. They're now also threatening countermeasures if the US insists on going its own way. So really, yes, this could lead to a new escalation here. Also interesting, we have a conversation between Donald Trump and Putin scheduled for today. We can take a look at that as well. Maybe something will happen here too. There were also rumors that there would be peace talks now, and maybe a ceasefire or something along those lines would be discussed here. It's possible that we might get some positive news from this as well. And now comes the real shocker. And this is honestly just crazy. First of all, we had the bond yield here. Where do we have it? Here we have the bond yields, which for the first time, you can see it, 30-year yields are now over 5%. And I'm not 100% sure if it's the very first time. But in any case, 5% has always been the magic threshold here. Here we can also see it. The 10-year bonds have risen by another 11 basis points. On the bond market, trading is happening as if we have rising inflation, no recession, and no trade agreements. If the Trump administration doesn't step in here, mortgages with 8% interest rates are looming. Higher extend is back. So it's already being implied here that Donald Trump should maybe step in. But what is he supposed to do? He's already done everything. He created chaos. It didn't help. He imposed tariffs. It didn't help. He lifted tariffs. That didn't help either. Inflation went down. That didn't help either. That means we've simply lost control. And we just have more and more countries that are dumping US Treasury bonds, and fewer that are still buying US Treasuries. So, the US is basically running out of active buyers here. Of course, you could try to make things attractive again with stable coins, with bid bonds or something like that. I just saw an interesting chart here. You can see here that Tether is currently about to, or is very close to, overtaking Germany in terms of US Treasury holdings. So, in terms of who holds more US Treasuries, there's Tether, then Germany, and of course at the very top you see Japan, then China, and then the UK. That's also a big reason why they made a trade deal with the UK. By the way, the US wants the UK to keep holding a lot of US treasuries, and apparently, they don't want to sell them off, or at least I think they don't want to. And that's going to become more and more of a bargaining chip for the US. They'll put pressure on countries that don't buy US treasuries. But now it's really interesting. If Tether keeps buying government bonds like this, then if Bitcoin ever hits 1 million, according to Willie Wood, they're very likely to become the #1 holder of US treasuries, even ahead of Japan. And that just shows how the market of new buyers is changing here. That means Japan is selling off, China is selling off, other countries are selling off, and then new buyers come in, like Tether, for example. These are the new shadow central banks, and they could, with stable coins, or maybe in the future even companies that issue bid bonds. I've already made a video about this. For example, Nakamoto, the company by David Bailey, or Jack Muller's company 21. These companies could just buy up government bonds when there are no other buyers left. But the problem is, right now, those buyers don't exist yet. It's possible that this market will still grow, but at the moment it's a declining market, and that's why yields are rising. And what does all of this have to do with? Of course, it's all related to the Moody's downgrade. There's also an assessment from the economic advisor to the US. Here, Hesed, the White House economic advisor, says that US debt is the safest bet in the world. Of course, that's a blatant lie. Bitcoin is definitely safer. Hesed calls Moody's decision to downgrade the US credit rating on Friday backward-looking. So he's saying now that it's just nonsense, but in my opinion, it's not nonsense at all. It's simply a reflection of reality. And it's obvious that this downgrade has really serious consequences, which means interest rates are going up, and now we have even fewer buyers. Now let's take a look at what's happening in other markets. We can also see here, the yield on Japan's 40-year bond has just reached its highest level in over 20 years. Japan's Prime Minister Ishiba describes the situation as worse than what happened in Greece back then. So apparently, Japan is also on the verge of a state bankruptcy, at least if you ask the Prime Minister. That means we're seeing these problems everywhere, all over the world. Government bonds are sometimes skyrocketing because people would rather flee to Bitcoin, gold, or something else. And now comes the real bombshell. We've been waiting for so long. When will the Federal Reserve react? When is Jerome Powell going to say something? When will the Fed step in? We've been saying all along that sooner or later, the Fed will have to intervene. All the Bitcoin people have been saying it, preaching it for years. Watch the bond market. Sooner or later it's going to break, and yields will shoot up. For example, Luke Groman always talks about 6.5% or so. If bond yields shoot past that level, the system just breaks, because we have to remember, the US has to refinance $9 trillion this year. And with current yields, well, with current interest rates, the cost of refinancing, the interest burden, is getting harder and harder to manage. And now, for the first time, we actually have the Fed saying central banks are ready to provide liquidity. So they're not just talking about themselves here, but also about other central banks, like in Japan, for example. Or, for instance, what we're seeing, not just in Japan, but also in China. For example, what's happening there? Here, Chinese state-owned banks will lower deposit interest rates on Tuesday. China is strongly stimulating its economy. So that's also happening this week. This isn't something that's going to happen sometime in the distant future. We're witnessing it right now. This is also seen as bullish for the markets, since the Fed is now on the verge of providing liquidity. Of course, there's still some room for interpretation. What does it mean to provide liquidity here? But in my opinion, it means that the floodgates for money are being opened, that stimulus is being provided now. And the Fed has also given its own assessment here, which is very, very interesting. They say here that the downgrade of the US or US debt will have an impact on capital costs, and this could affect the entire economy. So they are definitely in warning mode, in alarm mode here. And of course, that also explains why they're saying here, okay, now we're ready to inject liquidity into the market, and other central banks will also inject liquidity into the market, simply because there's a sense of panic now. People are in precaution mode, and it's assumed that the economy will come under more pressure. That's also easy to understand. If mortgage rates go up, then of course construction projects will go down. If all the refinancing costs for companies go up, then companies will go bankrupt. We already have a lot of zombie companies in Europe, more than in the US. But there are also zombie companies there that are basically only staying afloat because of cheap money. But if interest rates suddenly aren't 2, 3, or 4% anymore, but instead jump to 5, 6, 7, or 8%, it's obvious what will happen. As soon as these companies have to refinance, it'll break their necks and they'll go bankrupt. And then we'll have mass bankruptcies. Then we'll have unemployment. That leads to other consequences, to other problems. Then the Fed has to print more money again, which leads to even more inflation. But you have to print even more money to stimulate the economy. Then we get even more inflation. And it's all just a big vicious cycle. And it's very, very difficult to break out of that now. So the time to break out of this vicious cycle has pretty much run out, and it's really, really difficult to do anything about it now. I mean, the only thing you can really do here, like Michael Saylor, who just bought 7,000 new Bitcoin, that's pretty intense too. There was also another story with Michael Saylor that I have to make another video about. In any case, you buy another 7,000 euros. Of course, you can do that here. Sander Scientific, totally crazy. They just added another 1,000 new Bitcoin to their holding. They're now sitting at just under 8,000 Bitcoin. By the way, Sander Scientific is a company that I'm watching very, very closely. I'm honestly a huge fan of what they're doing here. This really looks absolutely wild. And if things go well here during the bull run, then in my opinion, Metaplanet could actually outperform MicroStrategy by a lot in the bull run. Of course, this isn't financial advice, but they obviously have a much bigger upside potential here. They also still hold much smaller amounts of Bitcoin. That's why they can potentially make much more impressive percentage gains, because with far fewer Bitcoin purchases, they can generate much more significant Bitcoin UCL. The next goal they set for themselves is for 2026, to accumulate 21,000 Bitcoin. In my opinion, if they keep up their special rate, they'll actually reach the goal ahead of time. We have some other bullish signals as well. For example, here we see UBS now saying that wealthy investors in Asia, those who are now distrustful of the US dollar, they're now buying Bitcoin and gold. Asia is bullish when it comes to real stores of value. And that's exactly what I told you earlier. The Chinese, Asia, people in Asia, and so on, they're dumping US Treasury bonds and buying gold. China is also one of the biggest gold buyers, if not the biggest. They're moving into gold, they're moving into Bitcoin, and they're getting out of US Treasury bonds. US Treasury bonds are no longer the trendy thing. Now the US has to come up with something. And like I said, either they'll try to push bonds onto the market, or they'll try to force it through with Tether somehow. But the current system just isn't working anymore. And now I have something really awesome for you. You absolutely need to mark this in your calendar. On May 28th at 7 p.m., the next mega immigration seminar will take place here, or rather, a live webinar. You're all warmly invited. It's completely free. Everyone can join. We'll really go through everything you need to know about immigrating right now. Earlier, there was news again that certain people from Germany are no longer allowed to immigrate. So you see, things are really heating up here. If you also want to chill here in El Salvador like I do, if you want to leave Germany or the EU, optimize your life, optimize your tax rate, raise your standard of living, pay fewer fees, and have more left over for yourself at the end of the day, we'll take a look at all of that. We'll also go into a lot of specific topics that we didn't cover in the last webinar. We'll talk about which countries are recommended, what steps you need to take to leave Germany or the EU, and how you can take your life to the next level here. Check it out. You can sign up for the next live webinar for free using the link below. I'll put the link for you down below. And if you still want to buy Bitcoin, I'll also add a link below to 21 Bitcoin, where you can easily and securely buy Bitcoin. With the code Bitcoin Hotel, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. Guys, I'll see you soon. Peace.